David Reeves was 34 years old, and 7 days before his wedding, he believed he was exactly where a man was supposed to be. He owned his business. He bought the house. He saved 14 months for her ring without telling a soul. Angela was everything he had worked toward. And Troy, his younger brother, was supposed to be standing beside him at the altar. That Saturday morning, David stopped by the wedding venue to drop off a vendor check. A door was cracked open. He slowed to surprise her. What he heard instead stopped him cold. Angela's voice, low, private, the register a person uses when the words cannot be said at full volume, saying 5 words that rewired everything. "I was with his brother yesterday." David did not move. He did not make a sound. He pulled that door closed, walked to his truck, and sat with his hands perfectly still on the steering wheel. And in that silence, he made a decision that 200 people would witness firsthand. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from, and subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. David Reeves sat at his worn but meticulously clean desk early Saturday morning, carefully reviewing the city contract bid spread out before him. The morning light filtered through the small office window, catching the row of framed licenses on the wall, each one earned through examination, not inheritance. His eyes moved methodically down the columns of numbers, checking every detail with the precision that had built his electrical contracting business from the ground up. The photo of him and Angela at Tybee Island caught his attention, angled just right on his desk so he could glance at it while working. Her smile in that moment had been real, unguarded, the kind that made her whole face light up. He'd kept that photo in the same spot for 3 years now, and like everything else in his life, it had become a steady, reliable presence. Taking a sip of his coffee, David returned to the bid numbers. If he landed this contract, it would mean triple the revenue, enough to hire 2 full crews, expand operations beyond what he'd dreamed possible when he started with just a van and a personal loan. At 34, he was exactly where he'd planned to be, the first man in his family to own both property and a company. The thought brought a quiet smile to his face. 7 days until the wedding. 6 years of building something real with Angela had led to this moment. She understood him, or he believed she did. Understood his need to measure twice and cut once in every aspect of life. Understood that his silences weren't absence, but presence. The focus of a man who believed in doing things right the first time. A memory of Troy surfaced unexpectedly. His younger brother at the grand opening of the business 2 years ago, showing up 40 minutes late, but somehow becoming the center of attention within 10 minutes of arrival. Troy had that gift, or curse, of making every room orbit around him. David remembered the way Troy had clapped him on the shoulder that day, saying, "You did all this without a degree. That's actually impressive," with that smile that made it impossible to call out the buried slight without seeming petty. Then there was the $400 Troy had borrowed in 2019, never mentioned again. Small things. The kind of things a man files away and forgives because blood is supposed to be thicker than the ledger where these debts are recorded. David had always done the forgiving, the way older brothers do. Finishing his review of the bid, David gathered the vendor check he needed to drop off at the wedding venue. The reception hall had been his mother's choice, bigger than he would have picked, but he'd learned to choose his battles carefully. The coordinator would be leaving soon, and he wanted to catch her before the weekend. The morning air was crisp as he locked up the office and headed to his truck. Atlanta was just beginning to wake up properly. Saturday traffic still light enough to make good time across town. He parked in the venue lot, noting with satisfaction that the coordinator's car was still there. The side door was unlocked, and David moved quietly through the service corridor toward the main office. His boots made little sound on the polished floor, the instinctive, careful movement of a man used to working in spaces where noise meant carelessness. As he approached, he heard voices from the bridal preparation room. The door was cracked open slightly. warm light spilling into the darker corridor. He recognized Angela's voice immediately and slowed his steps, a smile forming. 7 days. Maybe he could surprise her, share a moment before the chaos of the day began. Then he heard what she was saying. "I was with his brother yesterday." The words were low, private, spoken in that specific register people use when they're saying something that can never be said at full volume. There was a pause, then another woman's voice, just a sharp intake of breath, the sound of someone receiving confirmation of something they already suspected. David stood completely still in the corridor. He did not reach for the door. He did not make a sound. He counted to 5 in his head, the way he'd learned to do on job sites when something unexpected required careful response rather than reaction. With the same precise movement he used handling live wires, he pulled the door carefully, silently closed. He walked back through the service corridor, out the side door, across the parking lot to his truck. He got in. He sat. Outside the windshield, Atlanta continued its ordinary Saturday morning. A woman walked her dog along the sidewalk. 2 men were loading equipment into a van. The world moved exactly as it always had, unchanged by what had just shifted inside it. David's hands rested on the steering wheel. They were completely steady. David drove home on streets he'd traveled thousands of times, seeing none of them. The morning light had shifted, turning harsh and clear. But he barely registered the change. 5 words kept repeating in his mind, each repetition carrying the same weight as the first time he'd heard them through that cracked door. His hands remained steady on the wheel. The same steadiness his father had taught him was essential when working with live current. Don't let emotion make you careless. Don't let shock make you rush. Every movement measured, every response considered. The war inside him was precise and terrible. One part wanted to turn the truck around, walk back into that hall, and say his brother's name out loud in front of everyone present. That part wanted to watch Angela's face collapse, wanted to make them both answer for it right now, this morning, before another hour passed. That part of him was loud, and it wasn't wrong. But the second part, the part his father had built in him through years of watching a quiet man outwork, outlast, and outmaneuver every obstacle placed in front of him, said something different. It said, 5 words are not enough. You don't move until you know everything. You don't swing until you know exactly where you're swinging. He pulled into his driveway and sat with the engine idling. The house he shared with Angela stood before him, suddenly foreign in its familiarity. Every window, every line of trim, every carefully maintained detail looked exactly as it had yesterday. Nothing had changed, except everything. David pulled out his phone and called Keisha. Not to grieve, not to be consoled. To think out loud with the one person he trusted to think clearly alongside him. She answered on the second ring. "David? Everything okay?" "I need you to listen," he said quietly. "Just listen first." He told her exactly what he'd heard through that door. 5 words. The tone, the register, the way Angela's voice had dropped into that particular private frequency. He didn't elaborate or interpret. He simply reported it the way he'd report a technical finding on a job site. When he finished, Keisha was quiet for a moment. Then she asked the only question worth asking. "Is there any version of those words that means something else?" David closed his eyes. He gave it real consideration, because he was not a man who let what he wanted to be true override what he knew to be true. He replayed the words, the pause before them, the sharp intake of breath from the other woman in the room, not confused, but knowing. The sound of someone who already knew and was hearing it confirmed. "No," he said finally. "Then you need to move careful," Keisha said. "Nothing visible. Nothing that signals you know anything. Right now, you have 5 words and a feeling. 5 words and a feeling aren't a plan." "I know," David said. He was already thinking the same way. But before he hung up, he added, "I need to know how long, Keisha, because that changes what I do next." After ending the call, he sat for another moment before dialing Troy. His brother answered on the fourth ring, voice easy and warm. "Hey, man, what's up?" "Just checking about your tuxedo fitting," David said. "Want to make sure everything's confirmed." "Oh, yeah, all set. Picked it up yesterday, actually." Troy's voice was smooth, unbothered. Almost too unbothered. "Angela mentioned she saw the final setup at the venue. Said it looks amazing." There it was. Angela's name dropped casually, unprompted, then moved past too quickly. David listened beneath the words, the way he listened to equipment for signs of failure. Troy laughed once at something that wasn't quite funny enough to laugh at. His ease felt constructed, like a performance that had been practiced too many times. David filed it all away, said goodbye, hung up. That night, he lay beside Angela in their bed. She curled toward him the way she always did, her hand resting on his chest. Within 20 minutes, her breathing slowed and deepened into sleep, completely untroubled by the weight of what she carried. David lay with his eyes open, staring at the ceiling. The moonlight through their bedroom window cast familiar shadows he'd seen 100 times before. Her hand rose and fell with his breathing, the gesture of intimacy now feeling like another kind of betrayal. She slept fine. That detail lodged in his mind with particular sharpness, the ease with which she could lie beside him, touch him, drift into perfect sleep while carrying what she carried. The hours passed. 3, 4. He did not close his eyes. The next morning dawned gray and cool, typical for Atlanta in early spring. David moved through his morning routine with practiced precision. Coffee, shower, dress, keys. Nothing in his movements betrayed the weight he carried. Nothing signaled the work ahead. He drove to the office first, maintaining the pattern of his normal schedule. He texted Angela, "Morning, busy day ahead. Dinner at 7? Her response came quickly, "Can't wait. Love you." He set the phone down carefully, like something that might burn if held too long. In his office, David pulled out the small notebook where he'd been casually recording Angela's car mileage over the past few months. It was a habit born of his detail-oriented nature, the same way he tracked maintenance schedules and fuel efficiency. He hadn't known then why he was noting the numbers. He knew now. He laid out the past 6 weeks of entries alongside Angela's stated destinations. The discrepancies emerged immediately, clear as fault lines in concrete. 3 separate occasions when the miles didn't match her story. 23 extra miles when she'd claimed to be working late at the hospital. 37 unaccounted for during a supposed grocery run. 15 miles that didn't align with her book club meeting. David moved to their shared credit card account online. Angela rarely used it. She'd made that point repeatedly, kept it just for emergencies. He scrolled through recent transactions, his eyes catching on a charge from 3 weeks ago. A restaurant in Collier Hills. A Tuesday evening when Angela had texted about a late budget meeting. He knew Collier Hills, an upscale neighborhood they never visited, too far from their usual routes to make sense for a quick dinner. He plugged the restaurant's address into his phone and drove there, his movements unhurried and deliberate. The restaurant was upscale but not flashy, the kind of place that served people who didn't need to announce their money. At 10:30 a.m., the lunch setup was just beginning. An older woman with steel gray hair was arranging place settings near the host stand. David approached her, pulling up Angela's LinkedIn profile photo on his phone. Professional, unambiguous. "Excuse me," he said quietly. "I'm wondering if you recognize this woman?" The host studied the photo, her eyes showing the particular wisdom of someone who had seen enough to read situations clearly. "She comes in sometimes," she said carefully. "Always sits in the back, usually with a younger man." David thanked her, left a 20 on the counter, and walked out. In his truck, He pulled out his phone and composed a casual text to Troy. "You been to anything good in Collier Hills lately? My boy recommended a spot out there." Troy's response came fast. Too fast, like he'd been waiting by the phone. "Nah, I don't really get out that way. That whole area's not really my scene." A clean, smooth, completely unnecessary lie. The kind of lie only a guilty man tells reflexively, before even assessing whether the question required one. David screenshot the exchange and emailed it to himself. Back at his office, he logged into their shared phone plan. Both lines were under his account. He'd added Angela 3 years ago when they moved in together. The interface was clunky but functional. He downloaded the complete call and text logs for the past year. The data laid bare in front of him told its story in simple numbers: calls, texts, timestamps, contact between Angela's number and Troy's stretching back 11 months. Not sporadic, not random. Regular, sustained, deliberate communication, including during the weeks David had worked 70-hour days to build the savings that paid for Angela's engagement ring, funded the wedding deposits, and covered the down payment on the house he'd bought in both their names. While he was doing that, they were doing this. 4 days until the wedding. David sat in his truck in the empty parking lot of his own business. He set his phone face down in his lap. He gave himself exactly 10 minutes to feel the full weight of it. Not to cry, though the pressure behind his eyes was real, but to feel it completely and honestly, because he was not the kind of man who buried what was true. He felt it, all of it. The 11 months, the restaurant in the back corner, Troy's easy voice on the phone asking what he wanted for the rehearsal dinner, Angela's hand on his chest as she slept. At the 10-minute mark, he picked up his phone and called Keisha. "Get your notepad," he said. "We have work to do." That evening, David came home, set his keys on the hook by the door, and found Angela in the kitchen. He kissed her cheek like he'd done 1,000 times before. She smiled up at him, the same smile he'd woken up to for 6 years. "What do you want for dinner?" he asked. "Surprise me," she said. The morning air was crisp as David pulled into Keisha's office parking lot. It was barely 6 a.m., but her car was already there. She'd always been an early riser, even when they were kids. He gathered the folder from his passenger seat and walked to her private entrance. Keisha looked up from her computer as he entered, her eyes sharp and focused. No small talk, no good morning. She could read the weight he carried. She simply cleared her desk with one sweep of her arm, making space. David laid out the evidence methodically, the way he'd arrange tools before starting a complex electrical job. The phone logs first, highlighted and annotated. The mileage notebook with discrepancies marked in red. The restaurant receipt and the host's confirmation. Troy's screenshot. The unnecessary lie preserved in plain text. 11 months, he said quietly, while I was working overtime to pay for our future. Keisha studied each document, her accountant's precision evident in the way she arranged them in chronological order. She didn't offer sympathy or outrage. Instead, she turned to her computer and began typing. "I need to check something," she said, pulling up the business account she managed for David. "You added Angela as a signatory 2 years ago, right? For vendor payments, when you were on job sites?" David nodded. He remembered the day clearly. It had felt like another step toward their shared future, another brick in the foundation they were building. Keisha's fingers moved across the keyboard, pulling up transaction histories. Her expression shifted subtly, the kind of change only visible to someone who'd known her for decades. "David," she said carefully, "I need you to look at this." She turned the monitor toward him. The screen showed a pattern of transfers, small amounts, irregular intervals. Nothing that would trigger immediate attention. $260 here, $489 there, $312 2 weeks later, spread across 8 months. "I track every dollar that moves through these accounts," Keisha said. "These transfers, they're deliberate, designed to stay under radar. But when you add them up," She clicked another window. A total appeared. $11,400. David's hands gripped the edge of her desk. Not hard, just enough to steady himself. I can trace where it went, Keisha said, already working. Give me 10 minutes. She followed the money through a series of Venmo transactions, each one carefully structured to obscure its origin. After 20 minutes of focused work, she sat back. Found it, she said. A savings account opened 7 months ago at SunTrust. Joint account. She turned the screen again. There it was in black and white. Account holders, Angela Price and Troy Reeves. They hadn't just been having an affair. They'd been building a foundation, planning a future, using his money to construct it. David took the printed account statement from Keisha. He folded it carefully, precisely, and slipped it into a manila folder. On the tab, he wrote a single letter. W. I need to make 2 calls, he said. The first was to Jerome Price. David had always respected Angela's father, a self-made contractor who'd built everything through honest work. They met at a small diner off Ponce, away from their usual spots. Jerome, David said once their coffee arrived, I need to tell you something, but I can't tell you everything. Not yet. There's a situation involving people close to me. On the morning of the wedding, I need you present and aware that something serious is coming. Jerome studied him across the table. He was a man who recognized the weight of careful words. Whatever you need, he said simply. David's second stop was Pastor Dodd's office, ostensibly to review ceremony details. As they finished discussing the music selections, David paused in the doorway. Pastor, he said quietly, if someone needed a private word with you in the hour before the ceremony, would there be time for that? Pastor Dodd had known David since childhood. He looked at him for a long moment. For you, son, there is always time. When David arrived home that evening, he heard Angela's laugh from the kitchen. She was on the phone, stirring something on the stove with her free hand. He stood in the doorway watching her. This woman he'd loved for 6 years, who he'd built everything around. She saw him and smiled, mouthing, "Hi," while continuing her conversation. Everything looked completely normal, like any other evening in their shared life. David went upstairs to wash up for dinner. In the bathroom mirror, his reflection showed nothing of what he carried, nothing of what was coming. 2 days before the wedding, David sat in his truck outside his house, phone in hand. He stared at Troy's number for a long moment before pressing call. The line rang twice. Hey, big brother! Troy's voice carried that familiar warmth, the easy charm that had always opened doors for him. Got time for a drink tonight? David kept his tone casual. Just us. Kind of a send-off thing. Yes. Absolutely. Troy's enthusiasm came too quickly, too eagerly, the response of someone who needed this gesture of normalcy. Let me take you somewhere nice in Buckhead. My treat. Sounds good, David said. Text me the address. They agreed on 8 o'clock. David ended the call and sat with the silence in his truck. Even that brief conversation carried weight now. Every word from Troy felt like performance art. A studied portrayal of brotherhood that had fooled David for 30 years. The bar Troy chose was exactly what David expected. Upscale, modern, the kind of place that served complicated cocktails in vintage glassware. Troy was already there when David arrived, seated at a corner table, dressed business casual in a way that screamed careful effort. David! Troy stood, arms open, that million-dollar smile in place. Man, it's good to see you. They embraced. Troy held on a beat too long, like he was trying to prove something. Got you a bourbon, Troy said as they sat. The good stuff. Only the best for my big brother's last bachelor night. David lifted the glass. Appreciate it. Troy launched into easy conversation, work stories, family gossip, the kind of comfortable patter they'd shared their whole lives. He ordered a second round without asking. He made a toast to David's happiness that was so precisely calibrated, so earnestly delivered, that it would have read as genuine to anyone who hadn't spent 30 years learning to read Troy Reeves. David watched him the way he watched complex electrical systems. Not staring, not obvious, just registering every signal, every pattern. Troy laughed readily at his own jokes. He leaned forward when David spoke, performing attention. He kept calling David Big Brother, something he usually only did when he wanted something. Halfway through the second drink, during a lull in conversation, David spoke casually. "You ever want something belonging to somebody else so bad you told yourself you deserved it more?" Troy's laugh came automatically, then hitched, arriving a half-beat late. Something flickered behind his eyes. "What? You mean like when I used to steal your baseball cards?" He grinned, deflecting. "Man, remember that collection you had? I was so jealous." He changed the subject quickly, launching into a story about a client meeting. David let him. The question wasn't about getting an answer. It was about watching what the question cost him. They finished their drinks. Troy insisted on paying. "My treat. Seriously. I got this." And they walked out to the parking lot together. The night air was cooling, carrying the weight of late summer in Atlanta. Troy hugged him again, that same performance of brotherhood. "Love you, man. Can't wait for Saturday." As they embraced, David caught it. The scent he'd been unconsciously registering all night. Cedar and something darker, distinctive and familiar. The cologne Angela had given him for Christmas 18 months ago. David had worn it twice before setting it aside because it had always felt wrong on him somehow, like wearing someone else's clothes. Now he understood why. It hadn't been meant for him at all. They separated. Troy smiled that camera-ready smile. "See you Saturday, big brother." "See you Saturday," David said. He got in his truck and pulled out of the lot. At the first red light, he took out his phone and opened his contact. He found Troy's number, the same number that had been in his phone for 15 years, that had called him for favors and rides and cash, that he'd always answered because that's what brothers did. David deleted it, not in anger, not with shaking hands, with the quiet finality of completing a task that had been waiting 11 months to be done. The light turned green. He drove home through an Atlanta night that felt exactly like any other night, except that it wasn't. The private dining room at Marcel glowed with warmth. Crystal glasses caught the light from wall sconces, creating tiny prisms across white tablecloths. David sat at the head table, watching his mother Carol move between guests in her new dress, navy blue with delicate beading, bought specifically for this weekend. She squeezed hands and accepted compliments, radiating the specific joy of a mother seeing her family expand. Angela sat beside David in a cream-colored cocktail dress, her engagement ring catching the light when she gestured. She was luminous in a way that David now saw differently. Beneath her smile lived a nervous energy that had nothing to do with normal wedding anticipation. Her laugh came a touch too quickly at jokes. Her hand found his arm a bit too often, like she was checking to make sure he was still there. David played his role perfectly. He shook hands with uncles and cousins, accepted congratulations from church members who'd known him since childhood, laughed at the right moments. He refilled glasses and touched Angela's back when he passed behind her chair. No one in the room suspected anything. That was exactly the point. The restaurant had outdone themselves. Plates of perfectly seared steaks and roasted vegetables moved efficiently between tables. Wine flowed freely. Conversation hummed at that perfect pitch of celebration. Loud enough to feel festive, controlled enough to remain elegant. Everything was exactly as Angela had planned it 6 months ago when she chose this venue. Troy held court at a table near the center of the room, commanding attention the way he always had. He told stories that made people lean in, laughed in that way that made others want to laugh with him. Every few minutes his eyes found David's, and he'd raise his glass in a small gesture of brotherhood that landed like acid now. Midway through the main course, Troy's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, made a show of apologizing to his table, and stepped into the side hallway that led to the exterior door. David, who had positioned himself at the head table specifically for this sightline, waited 30 seconds before excusing himself. "Just need to check a text about tomorrow's timeline," he told Angela, squeezing her shoulder as he stood. The corridor was quiet, the dinner sounds muffled. Through the exterior door's frosted glass, Troy's silhouette was visible. David moved closer, silent on the carpeted floor. Troy's voice came through clearly, pitched low and intimate. "After tomorrow, we won't have to do this anymore. Just trust me. I'll explain everything later." David stood completely still. The words landed with devastating clarity. This wasn't an affair that had spiraled out of control. This wasn't reckless passion or poor judgment. This was constructed, planned. The joint savings account, the 11 months of sustained contact, the careful withdrawal of David's money. They had built an architecture for what came after the wedding, after David was legally and financially bound, after access was established, after the moment to walk away had passed, and his own brother was the architect. David waited until Troy ended his call, then walked back to the main room. He accepted a fresh glass of champagne from a passing server. Angela smiled up at him. "Everything okay?" "Perfect," David said, and kissed her temple. When the dessert plates were cleared, David stood. He lifted his glass, and the room quieted. He looked out at the faces turned toward him. Family, friends, church members who had watched him grow up. His mother wiped her eyes before he even began. "I want to talk about what it means to build something real," he said. His voice was warm, genuine. Not just feel it, but build it. Decision by decision. Sacrifice by sacrifice. The kind of love that's constructed through choices made every single day. He spoke about family as something earned rather than given. About trust as foundation rather than decoration. Every word was true, which made them devastating to everyone who would remember them later. "To all of you who helped build this moment," he concluded, "thank you. To my beautiful Angela." She squeezed his hand. "Tomorrow can't come soon enough." Glasses lifted. Several people dabbed their eyes. Carol Reeves beamed at both her sons. Troy's smile was perfect and empty. Later that night, David lay in his bed, in the dark. The house was quiet. Through the window, Atlanta's ambient glow painted patterns on his ceiling. For the first time in a week, his mind was completely still. He closed his eyes. Sleep came immediately, deep and dreamless. He was ready. The morning dawned clear and warm, the kind of Atlanta day that felt like a blessing. David stood before his bathroom mirror, adjusting his tie with steady hands. His suit was perfectly pressed, charcoal gray, tailored to his frame, chosen 6 months ago during a shopping trip with Angela. The memory settled like a weight in his chest, but his fingers never faltered. He was dressed and ready an hour before he needed to be. His shoes were polished to a military shine, his cufflinks, a gift from Jerome Price last Christmas, caught the morning light. By every visible measure, he looked exactly like a man preparing for the best day of his life. In a certain way, he was. The drive to the church was familiar. He'd made it hundreds of times over 34 years, the route embedded in muscle memory, Sunday services, youth group meetings, his father's funeral. The buildings along Ponce de Leon Avenue held the history of his life in this city, and now they would hold this morning too. The church parking lot was empty except for Pastor Dodd's weathered Buick. David parked beside it, gathered the manila folder from his passenger seat, and walked through the side entrance. The building was quiet, that specific silence of sacred spaces before they fill. His footsteps echoed on the polished floor as he made his way to the pastor's office. Pastor Dodd was already at his desk, Bible open, making notes for the ceremony. He looked up as David entered, and something in David's expression made him set his pen down immediately. "Son," he said quietly. David closed the door behind him. He sat in the chair across from the man who had baptized him, who had counseled him through his father's death, who had watched him grow from a serious 12-year-old into the man he'd become. Without preamble, he opened the folder and began laying out documents. The phone records came first. 11 months of sustained contact between Angela and Troy, highlighted and annotated. Then the financial transfers, each one dated and tracked. The joint savings account opened 7 months ago in both their names. The restaurant receipts from Collier Hills. The timeline, constructed with Keisha's methodical precision. Pastor Dodd read silently, his face growing graver with each page. When he finished, he removed his reading glasses and rubbed his eyes. The gesture carried the weight of every wedding he'd officiated, every counseling session he'd conducted, every moment of human frailty he'd witnessed in 40 years of ministry. "You're certain?" he asked finally. "Yes, sir," David said. The pastor nodded slowly. "What do you need from me?" "Let the ceremony begin normally," David said. "When we reach the moment, you'll know what I'm going to do. I need you to let me do it." Pastor Dodd looked at him for a long time. Then he nodded again, more firmly. "I trust you, David. I always have." David gathered the documents and left the office. In the foyer, he found Jerome Price exactly where he knew he'd be. Early, as always, checking the printed programs for any errors. Jerome looked up at David's approach, and something in his expression must have signaled what was coming. David handed him the folder without speaking. Jerome opened it. He read with the careful attention of a man who had built his own business from nothing, who understood numbers and what they revealed about character. His face didn't collapse. Jerome Price wasn't a man who collapsed, but something in it went very still and very old. He closed the folder. "How long?" 11 months, David said. Jerome exhaled through his nose. His jaw tightened once and released. "What do you need from me?" "Be in the room," David said. "When Angela tries to explain herself, stand up." Jerome looked at him steadily. "That's my daughter." "I know," David said. "That's why it matters that it comes from you." Jerome was quiet for another long moment. Then he straightened, handed the folder back, and walked into the sanctuary. He took his seat in the front pew, his back straight as a soldier's. Over the next 30 minutes, the church filled. Extended family claimed their usual pews. Church members who had watched David and Troy grow up settled into their regular seats. Co-workers, neighbors, childhood friends found places according to the usher's quiet direction. Carol Reeves sat beaming in the front row opposite Jerome, resplendent in pale blue silk, accepting congratulations and well-wishes with radiant pride. Troy stood at the altar in his groomsman's position, perfectly composed in his tuxedo, somehow managing to look both solemn and quietly pleased, the devoted younger brother playing his role flawlessly. He had no idea that this was the last morning anything would be flawless for him for a very long time. The music began. The doors opened. Angela appeared in white, ethereal, and genuinely beautiful. David watched her move down the aisle toward him, and he allowed himself to feel, fully and without flinching, the complete weight of what this was supposed to be. 6 years, the Tybee Island photo on his desk, the 14 months of saving for her ring, the house he'd bought in both their names, the life they'd been building, or that he'd thought they'd been building. He let himself feel all of it, because he wasn't a man who hid from truth, even the truths that cut deepest. Then he exhaled. He was ready. The ceremony began with familiar rhythms. Pastor Dodd's welcome washed over the congregation like warm water, his voice carrying the weight of decades spent shepherding this community through its most sacred moments. Morning light streamed through the stained glass, painting patterns on the wooden pews where generations of families had marked their milestones. David stood at the altar, his posture relaxed but alert. He could feel Troy's presence 2 feet to his right. The the specific gravity of a man who thought he was getting away with something. Angela stood across from him, radiant in white, her hands clasped around her bouquet with practiced grace. The congregation sat in warm attention, faces tilted up expectantly, waiting for the moment they had all gathered to witness. Pastor Dodd moved through the scripture readings with measured dignity. Words about love and faithfulness filled the sanctuary. David noticed how Angela's fingers tightened slightly on her flowers during certain verses. Small tells that would have been invisible to anyone who hadn't spent 6 years learning to read her movement. When Pastor Dodd reached the traditional pause, that moment in every ceremony that usually passed like a formality, his voice carried the same careful weight it always did. If anyone knows a reason why these two should not be wed, let them speak now, or forever hold their peace. The customary silence settled over the room. David broke it. He did not raise his voice. He did not turn to the congregation. He turned to Angela, only to Angela, directly and without drama, and spoke with the same steady tone he used, discussing electrical specifications with clients. "Angela," he said, "before we go further, I need to say something." A few people smiled, anticipating an unrehearsed declaration of love. Carol Reeves put her hand to her chest, already emotional. The room did not understand yet. David began laying out facts with precise, unadorned clarity. 11 months of documented contact between Angela's phone and Troy's. $11,400 transferred from his business account through a chain of small, careful movements. A joint savings account opened 7 months ago in Angela and Troy's names together. Regular meetings at a restaurant in Collier Hills where they always sat in the back. Troy's text message denying he had ever been to Collier Hills. He named each amount, each date, each detail. His voice never wavered. The room's understanding arrived like a wave. He could feel it reach the back pews, the ripple of shock moving through 200 people who suddenly realized they were not witnessing a wedding, but an execution. He turned to Troy. "You stood at my side this morning like a brother," he said. "You have been in my home, at my table, at our mother's table. You looked me in the face for 11 months." He paused. "You are not my brother anymore." Troy's composure cracked. Not dramatically, but visibly, the specific expression of a man whose performance had become suddenly and completely unsustainable. He opened his mouth. David did not give him space to speak. Carol Reeves rose from the front pew, her face a storm of denial and protection. "David, now wait just a—" Jerome Price stood. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Jerome Price was 60 years old and carried the physical and moral authority of a man who had never taken a shortcut in his life. He turned to Carol Reeves and said simply, "Sit down." The room went absolutely silent. Jerome faced the congregation, the people who knew his name, who knew his daughter's name, who had watched Angela grow up in this community, and spoke with the specific devastation of a father choosing truth over protection. "My daughter took money from this man's business account," he said. "I have reviewed the documentation myself this morning. I am standing in this church to tell you that what David has said is true, and I am ashamed of what my daughter has done." Angela broke. The composure she had maintained through David's address shattered completely under her own father's words. She reached toward Jerome. He did not reach back. She turned to David, said his name, began an explanation, partial, rising in register, the words of someone trying to reframe something that had already been fully framed. David looked at her with an expression that was not hatred and not cruelty. It was the expression of someone who had already finished something and was simply waiting for the room to catch up. "We're done here," he said. He turned to Pastor Dodd, who held his gaze for a moment and then gave a small, sorrowful nod. David walked down the aisle of the church where he was baptized, where his father's funeral was held, where he had sat every third Sunday for 34 years. He did not hurry. He did not look back. The congregation parted for him in complete silence, and the silence itself was a form of witness. 200 people who had heard everything, who would remember everything, who would carry this morning with them for the rest of their lives in this community. Outside in the warm Atlanta morning, Keisha was waiting beside his truck. She had been seated in the third row, exactly where he placed her, for exactly this moment. She held a document portfolio. She handed him an envelope without a word. Inside, a certified letter from his attorney, executed that morning, removing Angela Price as a signatory from all David Reeves' business accounts effective immediately, and a formal demand letter for the return of $11,400 with a 30-day response window before legal action commenced. David walked back to the church entrance. Jerome Price had followed him out, his face carrying the specific grief of a man who had done the right thing at enormous personal cost. David handed him the envelope. "Make sure she receives this today." Jerome took it. He looked at David for a moment. At this man he chose for his daughter, who turned out to be worth more than his daughter understood. "I'm sorry, son." "Don't be," David said. "You didn't do this." He got in his truck. He drove away. The consequences moved through Atlanta's black community like slow water, quiet, patient, inexorable. No dramatic confrontations were needed. The truth spoken in that sanctuary did its own work, seeping into every corner of the world Angela and Troy had taken for granted. The first ripple came from Pastor Dodd's deacon board. No public announcement was made. No formal proceedings were called. Troy and Angela each received a brief, carefully worded letter suggesting they seek worship elsewhere, while the congregation processed recent events. Being asked to leave the church you were raised in, not expelled in scandal, but turned away with quiet finality, carried a weight outsiders couldn't fully measure. In their community, in their family's world, it was generational. It was the withdrawal of belonging itself. Carol Reeves spent 3 weeks defending Troy in conversations that grew increasingly one-sided. She called David's friends, trying to explain what must have been a misunderstanding. She cornered church members after services at other congregations, insisting there had to be another side to the story. But fewer and fewer people were willing to have these conversations. The weight of the community's clear-eyed consensus. Troy did this. Troy knew what he was doing. Troy sustained it for 11 months, began to erode the defense she had built around her younger son. The silence that met her protests was not cruel. It was something worse. It was patient. People simply nodded, changed the subject, and carried what they had witnessed. Carol stopped calling David after his single text message. "I love you, Mom. Don't call me about this." She sat alone in her kitchen most mornings, drinking coffee and trying to reconcile the son she had protected for 30 years with the man who could look his brother in the face while building a life from stolen pieces. Troy's professional unraveling was equally quiet and equally complete. His manager, Gerald, a college friend of David's, who had received his wedding invitation as a courtesy and sat in the fourth pew, said nothing to Troy directly. He simply became unavailable in the specific ways that mattered. The quiet advocacy that smooths a career path, the informal support that protects a performer from scrutiny, the sponsorship that is never formally announced, but whose absence is acutely felt. Within 6 weeks, a performance review Troy expected to pass without friction surfaced 2 years of documented concerns that had been quietly set aside by a manager who no longer had any reason to set them aside. The improvement plan's terms were technically achievable, but the message was clear. Troy resigned before the outcome became something he couldn't put a better frame around. In Atlanta's black professional circles, where networks were tight and long-memoried and deeply relational, Troy's reputation didn't end dramatically. It simply became difficult. The referrals that used to flow toward him slowed to a trickle. The doors that used to open on the strength of a good impression began to require more. He wasn't destroyed overnight. He was diminished incrementally, which was its own particular punishment for a man whose primary asset had always been the impression he made. Angela's social world collapsed with similar quietness but absolute finality. Her two closest friends, women who had privately noticed things about her behavior over the past year that didn't add up, didn't stage a confrontation. They simply became unavailable, gradually and then completely, in the way that women who have decided something is over become unavailable. She discovered that the social identity she had carefully maintained, the devoted partner of a solid, self-made man, the woman with the beautiful relationship and growing household, had been fully and publicly dismantled in a single morning, witnessed by everyone whose opinion she had spent years cultivating. She couldn't rebuild it. The witnesses were everywhere. Every church function, every family gathering, every professional event where someone who sat in those pews would be present and would remember. The $11,400 was returned in full within 3 weeks. Jerome Price insured it personally, without explanation to anyone. The certified mail receipt was filed quietly in David's business records. No acknowledgement was requested or given. 2 months after the wedding, Troy attended a family cousin's graduation party. The house was full of extended family, aunts, uncles, cousins who had known him since childhood. David wasn't there, but David's name came up naturally in warm conversation. Someone mentioned his business winning the city contract. People smiled genuinely, expressing pride in David's success without performative intent. Troy sat alone in a corner of the living room, eating his plate quietly. No one was openly cruel to him. No one needed to be. The simple fact that David's name could be spoken with warmth while Troy sat in silence was consequence enough. He finished his food, made his excuses, and left early. No one tried to convince him to stay. Metal scaffolding gleamed in the morning sun as David Reeves stood at the back of the Midtown Atlanta construction site, his hard hat tilted slightly back as he watched his crew work the upper floors. The building rose 14 stories into the clear sky, the biggest electrical contract his company had ever taken on, one from the same city bid he'd been reviewing that Saturday morning when everything changed. He checked his watch, 10:45 a.m., right on schedule. The rhythm of work above him was steady and precise, the snap of conduit being mounted, the low hum of power tools, the call and response of his crew coordinating their movements. These were the sounds of something being built right, being built to last. The company truck parked nearby caught the sun on its fresh lettering. Reeves Electrical Contractors on both doors, the paint still pristine. Next to it sat 2 service vans, each bearing the same logo. In 14 months, he'd gone from 1 van and a dream to a fleet of 3 vehicles and 2 full crews. Not an empire, but something solid, something his. From his position, David could see Marcus, his newest journeyman electrician, showing a first-year apprentice the proper way to bend conduit. The young man watched intently, nodding as Marcus demonstrated the technique. David made a mental note to commend Marcus later. Teaching others was the mark of a man who understood that knowledge was meant to be passed on, not hoarded. The office trailer behind him hummed with activity. Through the window, he could see Sarah, his part-time receptionist, answering phones and organizing work orders. 3 days a week, she kept his paperwork flowing and his schedule straight, allowing him to focus on growing the business rather than drowning in administrative details. The trailer itself was temporary, but it represented something permanent, progress, measured in small, steady steps. A familiar car pulled into the lot, and David smiled slightly as Keisha stepped out, holding 2 coffee cups and a thick manila envelope. She navigated the gravel with practiced ease in her sensible heels, handing him one of the coffees before leaning against the truck's hood. "3rd municipal contract," she said, pulling papers from the envelope. "All finalized, all ready for your signature." Numbers look even better than we projected." David took a sip of coffee. Black, no sugar, exactly how he liked it, and reviewed the documents. The figures were strong, showing the kind of steady growth that came from careful planning and consistent execution rather than risky gambles. This was how you built something that lasted, one solid piece at a time. "Looks good," he said, signing where indicated. "Real good." Keisha tucked the papers away and studied him for a moment. "And how are you doing?" she asked, emphasizing the last word slightly. Not about the business, about him. David considered the question with the same careful attention he gave everything. The morning sun felt warm on his face, and somewhere above him the steady sounds of his crew continued their rhythm. "Good," he said finally. "Actually good." He meant it. He wasn't seeing anyone, hadn't been interested in trying. There was a peace in that choice that surprised him. No pressure, no timeline, no need to prove anything to anyone about moving on or starting over. 8 months ago, he'd bought a house, in his name only. Nothing flashy, but solid brick with good bones and a back porch that caught the morning sun just right. Every Sunday, he sat out there with his coffee before the city woke up, listening to birds and thinking about very little. Sometimes he'd spend hours just sitting, watching the light change and feeling the weight of ownership, not just of the house, but of his life. Every decision was his, every consequence too. He had lost a fiancé and a brother in a single morning, walked out of that church on his own 2 feet, and built something better from the ground up. The loss was real. He didn't deny it or pretend it didn't matter. But what he'd built in its wake belonged entirely to him. There was a different kind of peace in that. His phone buzzed against the truck's hood. An unknown number. David glanced at it, watched it ring. Without comment or hesitation, he let it continue until it stopped. He set it back down and picked up his coffee instead. Some things didn't require an answer. Some questions had already been answered 14 months ago, in a church full of witnesses, with nothing but truth and consequence. Above him, metal rang against metal, the clean, honest sound of men doing work they could be proud of. David finished his coffee in unhurried silence, handed the empty cup to Keisha with a nod of thanks, and walked back toward the building. He had work to do. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.